What happens when love meets betrayal and secrets shatter everything you thought was real? Follow Isabella as she faces a shocking marriage, a heart-wrenching discovery, and a world of lies that threaten to destroy her. Will she find redemption, or will the price of truth cost her everything? The journey to freedom is just beginning. Are you ready for the truth? Jackson Carter stood at the center of the ballroom, the shimmering crystal chandeliers casting a pale glow over the sea of well-dressed guests. The auction he had attended moments ago had been disastrous. His major investments had been exposed, and the press was already circling, hungry for the details. The sound of whispers, the mocking glances, and the very real feeling of impending collapse filled the room. His empire was crumbling, his reputation damaged beyond repair. Jackson took a deep breath, clutching the glass of champagne in his hand, though the taste was the last thing on his mind. His thoughts were racing, every possibility for recovery slipping through his fingers. In a moment of reckless desperation, he turned to the one solution that had been lingering in his mind for weeks: marriage. His eyes scanned the room, searching for someone who could help him. There she was, Isabella Ruiz, across the room, serving drinks, her movements smooth and professional, unaware of the storm that was coming. He had noticed her several times during his visits to the cafe she worked at. She didn't belong in this world of wealth and power, yet there was something about her, something that made her the perfect solution. She could save him. Jackson walked over to her, his heart pounding. As he approached, Isabella briefly looked up, their eyes locking for just a moment before she quickly looked away, as if she already knew the unspoken truth, that she didn't belong here, in this world of glitter and false smiles. "Miss Ruiz," he began, his voice calm but filled with a strange sense of urgency. "May I speak with you for a moment?" She blinked, confused, but nodded. "Sure, Mr. Carter. How can I help you?" Jackson looked at her, trying to find the right words. There was no time for pleasantries, no time for niceties. He needed her to understand, to agree to his proposition. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his suit jacket. "I'm in need of your help," he said, keeping his tone steady, though his insides were a storm of fear. Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Help? How exactly?" "I need to get married," he said quickly, as though saying it aloud would make it more real, less ludicrous. "To you." She took a step back, clearly stunned. "Excuse me?" he continued, words spilling out, each sentence more desperate than the last. "I'm facing a financial disaster. My company is on the verge of collapse, and I need a legal marriage to protect my assets. It's a simple arrangement. You marry me, and in exchange, I'll give you a comfortable life, a safe future for you and your family. No emotions, no expectations, just a contract. I'll take care of everything." Isabella stood silent for a moment, her mind racing. Her gaze flickered between his eyes and the champagne in his hand, then back to him. Was he serious? She had seen the headlines, heard the rumors. Jackson Carter, the mogul who had everything and lost it all in the blink of an eye. She almost laughed, but instead her voice came out shaky. "You want to marry me for protection? For your wealth?" Jackson nodded, his eyes pleading. "Yes, but I need someone who can help me, someone who has no ties to my past. You are the perfect choice." Isabella swallowed, her thoughts running wild. This was insane. But she had seen her family struggle, watched her mother work long hours just to make ends meet. Maybe this was her way out. She took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "And what do you get out of this? Just what? A title? A pretty face?" Jackson's expression softened, a brief flicker of vulnerability crossing his features. "I get the protection I need to survive this storm. It's the only way I can save myself, and maybe I can give you a better life in the process." He hesitated. "I know it's not ideal, but it's the only option." Isabella stared at him, a strange mix of disbelief and resignation in her chest. Was it really so bad to take this chance? He had money, a name, a future, or so it seemed. What did she have? A waitress job, unpaid bills, a mother who couldn't even afford proper medication. This was an opportunity. She sighed, looking around the room, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. The luxury, the wealth, the way people looked at her, none of it mattered. She could feel the pull of practicality, her heart urging her to grab this chance. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll do it. I'll marry you." Jackson exhaled sharply, almost as though he'd been holding his breath. A small, tight smile crept across his face, but there was no joy in it. "Thank you. You won't regret it." Isabella didn't answer. She couldn't tell if she had just made a life-changing decision or if she had just sold her soul to a man who saw her as nothing more than a lifeline. The first few days of marriage felt like a whirlwind to Isabella. The reality of living in Jackson's mansion, a massive estate in Beverly Hills, was so different from the cramped apartment she had shared with her mother and younger siblings. She could hardly believe it. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, a swimming pool she couldn't imagine ever using. The wealth, the luxury, all of it felt like a dream she was forced to accept. Isabella sat at the edge of the grand dining table, looking down at her meal. The food was exquisite, but it was hard to taste. Every bite felt distant, almost as if she weren't truly there, just a shadow of the woman she used to be. Jackson was already at work by the time she finished breakfast. He always was. He'd made it clear from the beginning that their marriage was purely a transaction, with no emotional strings attached. The coldness in his eyes when they had first met didn't waver, and now, after their marriage, it was even more evident. The servants who roamed the halls barely acknowledged her. She wasn't like them, wasn't part of this world. Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she was an outsider, playing a role she never auditioned for. Jackson's world, with its polished walls and glittering trophies, felt like a strange and hostile place. She walked through the enormous living room, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. She paused by the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling gardens. The view was magnificent. The perfectly manicured lawn, the tall hedges, the stone fountains, all of it felt surreal. She wasn't sure if she was lucky or cursed to be here. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned around to see Jackson entering the room, dressed in his tailored suit, looking every bit the part of a successful mogul. He gave her a brief nod as though acknowledging her presence, but didn't stop. His eyes were glued to his phone screen, his attention already consumed by the world outside their home. "Morning," Isabella said quietly, but Jackson didn't seem to hear her. She sighed, watching him walk past her without another word. The silence between them felt like an unspoken agreement. Keep it distant. Keep it simple. Jackson didn't want her to be part of his world. She knew that now. This wasn't a marriage based on love or mutual understanding. He had made that crystal clear from the beginning. She was a means to an end. Isabella shook her head. The realization stung more than she expected. She had told herself that she could ignore the emotional cost of this arrangement, that the money would make it worth it. But each day in Jackson's house, every untouched meal, every awkward silence between them, felt like a reminder that she was no more than a transactional agreement. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up and saw a message from her mother. "Isabella, how's everything going? Are you okay?" Her fingers hovered over the screen. She couldn't lie to her mother, not after everything she had done to help her get here. "I'm fine," Isabella typed back. But it didn't feel true. How could she explain the emptiness she felt inside, the loneliness that followed her through the halls of a mansion she never imagined herself in? She looked back out the window, watching the reflection of the sun shimmering off the pool's surface. She had never felt so out of place. As the day passed, Isabella wandered through the house, finding herself in rooms she didn't recognize, wondering how long it would take before she knew this place, as well as she knew the streets of South LA. It seemed impossible to imagine ever feeling at home here, surrounded by wealth and luxury that she had never dreamed of and never truly wanted. She wandered into the study, her eyes landing on a picture of Jackson with his family. He was younger in the photo, but the image struck her, a family of power, of privilege, all gathered in front of a mansion that seemed even more imposing than this one. She reached out and touched the glass frame. This was the life Jackson had fought for, the life that had cost him everything. It wasn't just money that consumed him. It was the need to prove he was worthy of his family's legacy. She was just a pawn in that game, no more than a means to protect what he had left. A soft knock on the door broke her thoughts. "Miss Ruiz," a voice called. Isabella turned to see one of the maids standing in the doorway. "Mr. Carter will be home soon. He's scheduled dinner for 6. Will you be joining him?" Isabella hesitated, feeling the weight of her position in this house. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steady but empty. As the maid left, Isabella exhaled. She didn't know what to make of this life. Was she really in a better place? Was this worth the price she had paid? Her freedom, her self-respect. Her phone buzzed again. It was another message from her mother. "If you need to talk, I'm here, honey. Don't forget who you are." Isabella stared at the screen, her fingers frozen. She wanted to believe her mother's words. But who was she now? Was she still the girl from South LA, or had she become something else entirely? The world outside this mansion seemed so far away, like a memory she wasn't sure she could reach anymore. The air in Jackson's office was thick with tension as Brock Davidson paced back and forth, his sharp shoes clicking against the marble floor. Jackson sat behind his desk, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, a faint tension in his jaw. His mind was a battlefield, torn between desperation and the need for rational thinking. "Jackson, this is it. The deal of a lifetime," Brock said, stopping in front of the desk. "This is your chance to salvage everything. If we secure this project, it's over. No more looming bankruptcy. You'll be back on top." Jackson's eyes flickered, but there was doubt in them. The entire situation felt off. Too much risk, too much on the line. But Brock was persistent, and Jackson couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. "I don't know, Brock," Jackson muttered, running a hand through his hair. "This is a huge gamble. We're talking about sinking millions into something we're not sure about." Brock leaned in, his expression turning serious. "And what's your alternative, Jackson? Wait for the money to run out? The lenders are circling like sharks. This is your shot. You think anyone is going to give you another chance after this mess?" Jackson swallowed hard. He could feel his palms sweating. He wasn't ready to face the truth, that he was standing on the edge of losing everything. His life, his empire, everything he had worked for, was teetering dangerously close to collapse. He could almost hear the whispers of his parents in his head, demanding perfection, demanding success. "I'm telling you, we do this deal. We get everything back." Brock pressed on. "We play it safe later, but for now we strike hard. The money is there. The connections are there. We just need to move fast." There was a long silence as Jackson processed the words. His mind raced, but his heart pounded harder. The weight of the decision pressed on him like a vice. "What about Isabella?" Jackson finally asked, his voice low. "What if this blows up in my face? What if—" Brock interrupted, his tone sharp. "What about her? She's not the one who's been building this empire. She's just your insurance, Jackson. She'll be fine." Jackson flinched, the words cutting deeper than he expected. Was that all Isabella was to him? Just a pawn in this high-stakes game? But he couldn't afford to think about that right now. He needed a way out of this financial mess, and this deal, dangerous as it was, seemed like the only option. "What's the catch?" Jackson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Brock smiled, a cold, knowing grin. "No catch. Just the price of doing business, my friend. The deal is high risk, but the reward is worth it. We just need to move fast, and we'll be back on track." As Jackson stared at his reflection in the polished glass of his office window, he felt his confidence begin to waver. Was this really the only option left? He didn't trust Brock completely, but Brock was right about one thing. There was no turning back now. He had no choice but to follow through. But the more Jackson thought about it, the more a feeling gnawed at him. Something wasn't right about this deal. He couldn't shake the feeling that Brock was hiding something important. His gut told him this wasn't the golden opportunity it seemed to be. There was a risk here that went beyond money. He had been warned about trusting too easily, but was it too late to walk away? The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. Isabella appeared in the doorway, her eyes soft but filled with concern. She looked beautiful in her simple dress, but there was an air of sadness about her that Jackson couldn't ignore. "Jackson, you all right?" she asked gently. Jackson forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." Isabella stepped closer, her gaze searching his face, sensing his unease. "You seem off. What's going on?" He hesitated. The words he wanted to say felt trapped inside him. Trust, money, betrayal. It was all tangled up and he wasn't sure where to start. "I have to make some decisions. Tough ones," he said, his voice steady but distant. He didn't want her involved in this. He didn't want her to know the truth about the deal, about Brock, about everything that was slowly suffocating him. "Whatever it is, you don't have to do it alone," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Jackson's heart twisted at her words. He wanted to reach out to her, but the weight of the lie he was living was too heavy. His empire, his identity, everything depended on this deal. But at what cost? "I know," he said quietly, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than he intended. "But this is my battle to fight." Isabella nodded, though her eyes betrayed a sadness he couldn't ignore. "I just want you to be happy, Jackson. That's all." He watched her walk out of the office, the door softly clicking behind her. The quiet that followed felt suffocating. Jackson turned back to the deal in front of him, his mind still swirling. He was so close to securing his future, but at the cost of everything he cared about. And even if he went through with it, he wasn't sure he could ever escape the feeling that something vital was slipping away. Isabella couldn't sleep that night. The weight of her decision, the promise she had made to Jackson, felt like it was crushing her. The walls of the mansion, grand as they were, felt suffocating. Every corner of the house reminded her of how much she didn't belong here. Her thoughts were a mess, torn between her growing affection for Jackson and the growing unease that gnawed at her. The morning light barely peeked through the thick curtains before she found herself pacing the hall, her mind working overtime. She needed answers. It had been days since Jackson had last spoken to her with any real openness. His coldness had returned, as if the warmth of their fleeting moments had never happened. Isabella's frustration with his silence deepened, but there was more. There was something about his past that didn't sit right with her. After breakfast, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She found the study, the door slightly ajar. The old wood felt intimidating beneath her fingers as she pushed it open. It wasn't the first time she had been in here, but today she was determined. Jackson's business papers, financial records, and even old family photos were neatly stacked on the large mahogany desk. She needed to understand him, to see what had shaped him. Isabella's eyes scanned the room, her gaze landing on a drawer at the far corner of the desk. It was slightly open, and as she approached it, her fingers hesitated. She knew she wasn't supposed to snoop, but something deep inside urged her to find the truth. Her hand trembled as she opened the drawer fully, revealing a stack of old photographs, their edges yellowed with time. A family portrait caught her attention. A much younger Jackson, standing next to a man she could only assume was his father, a cold, imposing figure. His face was set in a permanent frown, eyes sharp, his posture straight and almost militant. Beside them, a woman, Jackson's mother, Isabella assumed, had a look of disapproval in her eyes, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Isabella felt a lump form in her throat. The picture was a stark contrast to the man she had come to know, a man who hid behind walls, both literal and emotional. This wasn't the Jackson she saw every day. This was a man who had been shaped by something much darker. Her fingers shuffled through the rest of the photos, each one more unsettling than the last. There were family vacations, happy moments, but they all seemed manufactured, like a performance for the world to see. And then, a photograph of a younger Jackson standing in front of a building that had a name on it. Something about a company she didn't recognize. Curious, she grabbed the piece of paper that was tucked behind the photo. The name on it made her stomach twist. Carter Enterprises. She knew that name. It was Jackson's family business, the one that had made him a millionaire. But the date on the paper, 10 years ago, was odd. There were accounts, legal documents, and a trail of money that seemed to disappear into nowhere. Her mind raced as she began piecing things together. This wasn't just about wealth. This was about power, control, and a family that used Jackson as a means to an end. The coldness, the distance, it wasn't just a personality trait. It was learned behavior. The father's sharp, cruel eyes made sense now. Jackson had grown up in this world of manipulation and ruthless business dealings. The door creaked behind her, and Isabella quickly shoved the papers back into the drawer, heart racing. She turned only to find Jackson standing in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her with a quiet intensity. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. Isabella felt her pulse quicken. I wasn't snooping, I needed to understand." Jackson didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there watching her, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. Then he stepped forward, his footsteps heavy. "You don't need to understand," he said, his voice low. "There's nothing to understand. Nothing good, at least." Isabella's heart sank. She wanted to say something, wanted to confront him with what she had learned, but the fear in his eyes held her back. "You have no idea what it's like to grow up like this," Jackson continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "To be the one who was always expected to be perfect, to live in the shadow of a name that means nothing but expectations. My father, he built this empire, but he never once cared about me. Not really." He paused, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't even know who I am without this." Isabella could see the hurt in his eyes now. For the first time, he wasn't the distant man she had married. He was just a man struggling to hold on to what little he had left. "I'm sorry," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know." Jackson shook his head. "No, you don't." He turned to walk away, but before he left the room, he stopped and glanced back at her. "I never wanted any of this. I just needed to survive. And now, everything I've built is crumbling." Isabella stood there, feeling a wave of sympathy wash over her. But it was more than that. It was understanding. This wasn't just about the money. This was about survival. Jackson had never been given a chance to live for himself. He was living for the expectations of others. As he left the room, Isabella's heart ached for him. But at the same time, she felt a growing sense of doubt. Was she really the one to help him? Was she prepared to handle what he had become? She couldn't say for sure, but she was in this now, and she wasn't sure how to get out. Isabella didn't know when it happened, when she started to notice the tension in Jackson. It had been subtle at first, a small shift in his behavior, but it had grown harder to ignore. She could feel the distance between them widen with each passing day. He was more distracted, more aloof, and the more she tried to reach him, the more he pulled away. She couldn't help but feel like the walls he had built around himself were closing in on both of them. It was late one afternoon when she first saw her, Monica. She was standing outside the front door, casually leaning against the marble pillar as if she owned the place. Her presence was undeniable, elegant, poised with a beauty that radiated confidence. The moment Isabella laid eyes on her, she knew exactly who she was. Monica, Jackson's ex-girlfriend. Jackson had never talked about her much, but Isabella had heard enough through the whispered conversations of the staff, the subtle glances, the way Jackson's face would stiffen whenever she was mentioned. Isabella had always felt a strange unease whenever Monica's name came up, but seeing her standing there right outside their home made her stomach churn. Jackson emerged from the front door just as Isabella stepped onto the stairs. Monica smiled brightly as Jackson approached, her eyes flickering with something darker beneath the surface. Isabella noticed how Jackson's shoulders tensed when he saw her. His face briefly softened, as if the weight of the world had lifted. But then he caught Isabella's gaze, and the softness vanished. "Monica," Jackson said, his voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" Monica didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, placing a hand on Jackson's arm, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, though there was a glint of something else in her eyes, something calculating. "I thought I'd drop by and see how you're doing." Isabella stood frozen, watching the exchange. There was something about Monica's demeanor, something too familiar, too comfortable, that made her stomach twist in knots. She could feel the tension between them, like an invisible thread pulling them together, But it wasn't just friendly familiarity. There was a history between them, one Isabella wasn't sure she could understand. Jackson cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward Isabella, but he didn't look at her long enough to offer any reassurance. "I appreciate the concern," he said, his tone clipped. "But we're fine." Monica's gaze didn't leave Jackson's face. She stepped closer to him, tilting her head with a mock pout. "You always were good at keeping things to yourself," she said. "I remember how you used to keep me in the dark, too." Isabella felt a sharp pang in her chest. The insinuation was clear. Monica was speaking from experience, and Isabella had no doubt that this was more than a mere friendly visit. Jackson took a deep breath, clearly uncomfortable. "Monica, this isn't the time." "Why don't you let me decide that, Jackson?" Monica interrupted, cutting him off. She finally turned her attention to Isabella, her gaze sharp and calculating. "You must be Isabella, the new wife. How wonderful for you. But don't you worry, I'm not here to steal him away," she added with a wicked grin. "I know my place." The bite in her words hit harder than Isabella had expected. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment she wasn't sure whether to feel anger or insecurity. Jackson had made it clear that he married her out of necessity. But now, standing here with Monica's presence hanging over them, Isabella felt small, insignificant, like a visitor in her own life. Monica seemed to sense her discomfort. She smiled, almost knowingly. "I'm sure you've heard plenty about me by now," she said, her voice low, deliberate. "Jackson and I, we had a special connection, a bond, if you will. Some things you just can't erase." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the jealousy rising within her, but she tried to keep it in check. Monica was a ghost from Jackson's past, but why did it feel like she was still so present? Jackson stepped back, putting distance between them. His hand briefly brushed Isabella's, but he didn't hold it. He was trying to maintain control, but the control was slipping. His gaze flickered to Isabella, then back to Monica. "Monica, I told you," Jackson began, his voice more forceful now. Monica took a step back, crossing her arms in a dramatic fashion. "Fine," she said, her voice soft but dripping with sarcasm. "I'll leave, but don't think I'm going anywhere just because you found a replacement. I'll always be part of this, Jackson. Always." With one last, lingering glance at both of them, Monica turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the pavement as she disappeared around the corner of the house. Isabella stood motionless, staring after her. Her heart was racing. She wanted to say something, to scream at Jackson, to demand the truth. But all she could do was stand there, feeling like a stranger in her own life. Jackson sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said quietly, his voice weary. "She's not..." "Not what, Jackson?" Isabella interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not who I think she is? Not someone you still care about?" Jackson didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his back to her and walked toward the living room. It was the silence that cut deepest. Isabella followed, her heart heavy with doubt. "Jackson," she started again, but her voice cracked. She couldn't shake the feeling that Monica's return was just the beginning of something much darker. A reminder of everything Jackson had buried, and a threat to everything she had hoped to build. The next few days felt like a fog to Isabella. The tension between her and Jackson had reached a breaking point. After Monica's unexpected return, things between them seemed to shift irreversibly. Jackson had tried to act as though nothing had changed, but the cracks in their marriage were growing more visible. Isabella noticed the way Jackson became more distant, more closed off, his mind constantly elsewhere. She could feel his emotional withdrawal like a physical ache. But what hurt more than his silence was the realization that she didn't know him. Not in the way she had hoped, not in the way she deserved. The man she had married was buried under layers of secrets, and she had only begun to scratch the surface. But now, a different kind of secret was unfolding, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. One evening, as Isabella wandered through the mansion's vast hallways, she overheard Jackson speaking in hushed tones in his office. Curiosity got the better of her. She stopped, her breath catching as she pressed herself against the wall, trying to listen without being noticed. "The money's disappearing faster than I thought. We need to secure the deal tonight. There's no more time to waste. Jackson's voice was tense. The words hung in the air, but they weren't what made Isabella's heart sink. It was the second voice, Brock's, that she recognized. You're right, Brock replied, the coldness in his voice unmistakable. But remember, if things go south, we'll need a scapegoat. You can't afford to take all the blame. She's the perfect distraction. Isabella froze. Her mind raced as the words sunk in. A scapegoat. She wasn't sure what it meant at first, but the realization hit like a punch in the gut. She was the scapegoat. The deal they were talking about, the one Jackson had been so insistent on, wasn't just about saving his empire. It was about something darker, something she hadn't seen until now. Her legs felt weak as she quietly backed away from the door, her stomach twisted into knots, a feeling of dread pooling in her chest. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she knew she was at the center of it. Isabella's head was spinning as she retreated to her room, pacing back and forth. The unease was unbearable. She had always known there were pieces of Jackson's world she didn't understand, but now she felt like she was suffocating under the weight of the secrets he had kept from her. She wasn't just his wife in name. She had been drawn into something far more dangerous. The next day, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her thoughts kept returning to the conversation she had overheard. She couldn't bring herself to confront Jackson about it. Not yet. There was too much at stake. But she needed answers. Isabella decided to do what she always did when faced with uncertainty. Dig deeper. She began to go through Jackson's files, the ones he had left scattered across his desk. Each document seemed more troubling than the last. There were contracts, signed papers, legal documents that didn't make sense to her at first. But what stood out were the numbers, large sums of money that kept disappearing without explanation. It didn't take long for her to find the key piece of the puzzle, a transfer of funds signed off by Brock, with Jackson's name attached as a co-signer. The money had been moved into an offshore account. It wasn't just money. It was the money from the real estate deal Jackson had been so desperate to close. Isabella's heart pounded as she stared at the screen. She felt a sense of betrayal that ran deeper than anything she had imagined. It was all starting to come together. Jackson hadn't just been trying to save his business. He had been involved in something far more complicated, something he had hidden from her. And now, it was all coming to a head. Before she could process what she had found, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. She quickly shut the laptop and straightened up, pretending like she had been doing something else. But there was no time to hide the truth. The betrayal was right in front of her. Jackson walked into the room, his face unreadable. He seemed distant, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his own lies. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there looking at her as though trying to find the right words. "What's going on, Jackson?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I know something's wrong. I overheard you and Brock talking last night. What's really happening?" Jackson's face paled. He didn't try to deny it. He didn't even try to explain. Instead, his eyes darkened with guilt as he took a slow step toward her. "You shouldn't have heard that," he said softly, almost apologetically. But there was no excuse in his voice. He looked like a man caught in a web of his own making. "You were going to use me," Isabella said, her voice shaking. The words felt foreign, but the anger inside her gave them power. "You've been using me to cover your mistakes, haven't you?" Jackson's silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Isabella felt a lump form in her throat. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, wasn't who he had claimed to be. "I thought you married me to protect me," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "But now I see it wasn't about me at all. It was all about saving yourself." Jackson stepped back, as though the weight of her words had hit him harder than anything else. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to drag you into it. But I had no choice, Isabella." "No choice?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You always had a choice, Jackson. You just chose the easy way out." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him one last time. She had given him everything, and he had turned it all into a lie. The man she had married had disappeared into the shadows of his own deception, and the woman standing before him was left holding the pieces. Isabella's world felt as though it was spinning out of control. Each day felt heavier than the last, and the tension between her and Jackson had become unbearable. After their confrontation the night before, she knew things couldn't go back to how they were, but still she tried to push forward, tried to focus on the life she had built for herself in this strange, foreign world of wealth and uncertainty. It was late in the afternoon when the accident happened. She had been driving home from the grocery store, her mind still racing from the conversation she'd had with Jackson. He hadn't even tried to apologize, not for using her as a pawn in his schemes, not for the lies. She could still see the look in his eyes. Guilt, but also something else, something she couldn't quite place. As she navigated the familiar streets, her thoughts continued to churn. But as she turned a sharp corner, the tires of her car hit a slick patch of road, sending her spinning out of control. The brakes screeched, but it was too late. The car slammed into a pole, sending a jarring shock through her body. For a moment, everything went silent. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, and her vision blurred as she tried to collect herself. The seatbelt had saved her from the worst, but the shock of the crash left her feeling disoriented and dizzy. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding against her chest. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Blood had trickled down from a cut on her forehead, and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She had no idea what had just happened, only that everything had changed in the span of a few seconds. As the world outside the car began to come back into focus, Isabella realized she needed to get out, but her body felt heavy, as though the shock had settled into her bones. She fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Panic began to rise in her chest as she slammed her fist against the door. After a few more attempts, the door finally gave way, and she stumbled out onto the pavement, the cool evening air hitting her like a slap in the face. Her legs were shaky and her breath was ragged, but she managed to stand. Her mind raced, but all she could think about was Jackson. Was he going to notice? Was he going to care? Then the sound of a car engine approached. Isabella turned, and to her surprise, it was Jackson. His car pulled up alongside hers, screeching to a halt. His face was a mix of fear and frustration as he rushed out, his eyes scanning her up and down. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, his voice strained with panic. He grabbed her shoulders, inspecting her for any serious injuries. His touch was cold, distant, yet there was something in his eyes that Isabella couldn't quite read. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Just shook up, that's all." Jackson let out a frustrated sigh, clearly not convinced. He didn't say anything for a long moment, but the tension between them hung thick in the air, unspoken and heavy. This wasn't just about the accident. There was something more between them now, something broken. "Let me take you to the hospital," he finally said, his voice low, almost resigned. Isabella didn't argue. She could tell that despite the coldness that had plagued their relationship, something was different now. It was as if the accident had cracked open a door, one she didn't know if she was ready to walk through. As they drove to the hospital, the silence in the car was suffocating. Isabella didn't want to speak, didn't want to say anything that might make this moment more real. Jackson, on the other hand, seemed to struggle with his own thoughts, his hands tight on the wheel. He glanced at her once, then back to the road, and again. There was that hesitation in his eyes. They arrived at the hospital, and Jackson quickly ushered her into the emergency room. The doctor was quick to assess her injuries, a few cuts, some bruises, but nothing that would require serious attention. But the emotional toll was another matter. The more Jackson tried to reassure her, the more distant she felt. As they sat in the waiting room, Jackson's voice broke through the silence again. "Isabella, I'm sorry about everything. I never meant for any of this to happen." She looked at him, but it wasn't the apology she was looking for. There was no accountability, no real emotion behind the words, just a man trying to fix something he had broken without fully understanding what needed to be fixed. "I don't know what to say anymore, Jackson," Isabella whispered, her voice strained. I thought I could trust you, but I can't even recognize the man I married." Jackson winced as though the words stung. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, lost in the gravity of the moment. And Isabella realized then that the real accident wasn't the crash. It was the way their marriage had crumbled before her eyes. The accident was just the tipping point, the thing that broke the facade of a life she had been clinging to. She didn't know what would come next. All she knew was that the man sitting next to her wasn't the same one she had agreed to marry. And that hurt more than anything. The crash had been the tipping point. But as the days passed, it became clear that the fallout from Isabella's accident would be the least of their worries. News of Jackson's financial troubles had already spread like wildfire. And now, with his empire teetering on the edge, the media was on the hunt for anything they could use against him. It started with a small article in a local paper, a brief mention of Carter Enterprises, and the rumored collapse of Jackson's business. But within hours, it exploded. By the next day, every major news outlet had picked up the story, plastering Jackson's name across headlines, speculating about his financial downfall, and drawing attention to the shady deals that had been rumored for years. Isabella couldn't escape it. The whispers were everywhere, at the grocery store, in the cafe, at the doctor's office. People stared at her now, and she could feel the weight of their judgment. She wasn't just a part of Jackson's world, she was a target. She could hear the unspoken question every time someone looked at her. How could she marry a man like him? The tabloids dug deeper, turning their focus to Jackson's personal life. They didn't hesitate to splash his broken marriage across their pages, speculating that Isabella was just another victim in his web of lies. They painted Jackson as a man who had used his wealth to manipulate and control everyone around him, from his family to his business partners to his wife. One morning, as Isabella sat in the kitchen, the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat, and she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because of the endless parade of reporters and strangers that had been showing up, demanding interviews, asking questions that no one had any right to ask. She had stopped answering the door, hoping that the intrusion would eventually stop. But today, it was different. She opened the door slowly, and her breath caught when she saw a familiar face standing on the other side. Monica. "Isabella," Monica said, her voice smooth and calm with just a hint of something more dangerous beneath the surface. "I need to talk to you." Isabella stepped back, confused. "What do you want?" Monica didn't answer right away. She looked at Isabella, her gaze a mixture of pity and amusement. "I think we both know why I'm here. Jackson's in trouble and he's not handling it very well, is he?" Isabella stared at her, her jaw tightening. She knew exactly what Monica was implying. Jackson's scandal was now in the open, and Monica had always been there, a constant in Jackson's life, even when he claimed he wanted nothing to do with her. And now, she was here, probably waiting for the perfect opportunity to swoop in and remind Jackson of his past mistakes. "I don't want any part of this," Isabella said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. She wasn't about to let Monica manipulate her. Not now. Monica smiled, the expression almost too sweet. "I know you're upset, I understand, but you've been dragged into something bigger than you realize. I think it's time for you to start thinking about your future. The way Jackson's falling apart, you won't have a place in it for long." Isabella felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard enough. Monica wasn't just trying to speak to her. She was trying to tear her down just like everyone else had tried to do. "I don't need your advice," Isabella said, her voice colder now. "You should leave." Monica's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'll leave, Isabella," she said softly, her tone almost mockingly sweet. "But don't say I didn't warn you. Jackson won't change. He's always going to be the same man he's always been, a man who uses people to get what he wants." Isabella shut the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Monica's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake them. She couldn't let herself fall for the same manipulation Jackson had been subjected to his entire life. Later that evening, Jackson returned home, his face drawn and tired. The look in his eyes made Isabella's heart ache, but she didn't know if she could afford to feel sorry for him anymore. "Jackson," she said, her voice quiet as he entered the living room. I need to know the truth. About everything, the money, the deals. What's really going on? Jackson stopped, his hand still gripping the doorframe as if he was unsure whether to face her or retreat into the shadows. Isabella, I've already told you what you need to know. This is all going to blow over. That's not enough, she insisted. I'm not some part of your plan, Jackson. You don't get to drag me into your mess and expect me to just sit back and let it happen. He finally turned to face her, his face a mask of exhaustion and frustration. I didn't want this for you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's happening, and I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to fix this. Isabella stepped closer, her anger now replaced by something else, a feeling of utter betrayal. You don't know how to fix this, she repeated, the bitterness in her voice rising. You've been lying to me from the start, using me to cover up your mistakes. The silence between them was suffocating. Jackson's shoulders slumped as he sat down on the sofa, burying his face in his hands. Jackson, this is a public scandal, Isabella said, her voice trembling now. Your name is everywhere. I don't even know if I can trust you anymore. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of desperation and shame. I never wanted this for you. I never wanted to drag you into this world. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. Well, you did. And now I have to live with the consequences. As the silence stretched on, Isabella realized something. No matter how much Jackson claimed to care, the truth was, he had dragged her into this mess. And now it was up to her to decide how much more she was willing to lose. Isabella sat at the edge of their bed, staring at the quiet darkness outside the window. The storm that had been brewing for weeks was finally here. Her mind kept replaying the conversation with Jackson from earlier, the lies, the guilt in his eyes, and the crushing realization that nothing was as it seemed. She had trusted him. She had believed in him, even when everything around them fell apart. But now, after everything they had been through, after the betrayals, the secrets, and the manipulations, she couldn't ignore the one truth she had been running from. Jackson had never been honest with her. The past week had been a whirlwind of accusations and confusion. The press was all over Jackson's financial problems, and every day seemed to bring a new scandal, a new lie being exposed. But this latest discovery hit harder than anything else. The betrayal was so much deeper than she had imagined. She had been sitting in the living room, going through some of Jackson's papers she had hoped would help her understand the mess he had gotten himself into, when she found it. A set of documents she wasn't meant to see. Contracts, money transfers, and most shockingly, a list of names. Names of people Jackson had been working with. People she didn't recognize but were tied to shady deals. The very same people Jackson had assured her were just business associates. But these weren't just associates. These were the people behind the schemes that had ruined Jackson's business. And the more she looked, the clearer it became. Brock was involved in this, and Jackson wasn't just a victim. He was an active participant. Isabella's hands shook as she put the papers down. The final betrayal hit her harder than anything else. She had always known something wasn't right. But this was proof. Jackson wasn't just an innocent man trying to survive a storm. He had chosen this path. He had lied to her, used her as a shield, and when it became too much, he had tried to hide behind her. The door creaked open behind her, and she didn't need to turn around to know it was him. Jackson entered the room, his footsteps slow and measured. He had been different since the scandal broke, more distant, more resigned. The weight of everything seemed to have crushed him into someone unrecognizable. I know what you're going to say, Jackson said quietly, his voice tinged with exhaustion. But you need to understand, this wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't plan for this. Isabella stood up, her heart pounding. She felt a strange calm wash over her, the anger and hurt now replaced by something even stronger, clarity. She wasn't going to stand by and let him continue to manipulate her. Not anymore. No, she said firmly, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. You didn't plan for it, or did you? She turned to face him, her eyes sharp with disbelief. I found the papers, Jackson. I found the transfer of funds, the contracts, the names. Don't lie to me. You've been lying to me this entire time." Jackson's face went pale. His lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment he stood frozen, as though the weight of her words had finally reached him. But then the mask slipped and his defenses came crashing down. "Isabella," he began, his voice faltering, "you don't understand. Everything I've done, I did for us, for you. I thought I could fix it. But it all just got out of control. I never meant to hurt you." "Never meant to hurt me," Isabella repeated, her voice growing louder. "You think that just because you didn't intend for this to happen, it's okay? You think I'm some fool who's supposed to stand by and watch you destroy everything? I'm not part of your plan, Jackson. I am not your pawn." He stepped forward, reaching out to her, but she backed away, shaking her head. "No, don't touch me. You've already done enough damage." Jackson's face twisted in frustration and guilt, his eyes filling with unshed tears. "I didn't know who to turn to. I didn't know how to stop it. I thought if I just kept going, kept pretending everything was fine, we could get out of this." "You don't get it, do you?" Isabella said, her voice shaking now with a mixture of hurt and rage. "You dragged me into this mess, Jackson. You used me. You used my trust to cover up your lies. And you didn't think about me for 1 second, did you? You just thought about saving your empire, saving your reputation. But look at you now, everything's falling apart and you're still trying to play the victim." Tears sprang to Jackson's eyes, but they weren't the tears of remorse she had hoped for. They were the tears of a man who had run out of excuses, out of options. "I'm sorry, Isabella," he whispered. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." Isabella could barely look at him. The man she had once loved, the man she had believed in, had turned out to be nothing more than a stranger. A stranger who had lied to her at every turn, who had put his own needs above everything else. "Sorry doesn't fix this," she said softly. "You've already made your choice, Jackson, and I'm not going to be a part of it anymore." Jackson's eyes widened as if her words had hit him like a physical blow. He reached out to her again, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "You made your bed. Now you have to lie in it. I can't be here anymore. I can't be part of this." She turned and walked out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was certain. She couldn't stay with someone who had betrayed her so completely. The days after their confrontation felt like a blur to Isabella. She had packed her things quietly, not saying much to Jackson, who had barely spoken since that final argument. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but none of them mattered anymore. Jackson had proven that he would never change, no matter how many promises he made. She had been a pawn in his game, a means to an end, and now she was done. She left their mansion behind without a second glance. For the first time in what felt like forever, Isabella didn't have to pretend. She wasn't the woman standing next to the broken man, trying to save him from himself. She wasn't the wife of a millionaire who thought he could control the world. She was free, but freedom came with its own weight. As she sat on the bus, her belongings in tow, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her decisions settling over her. Was it truly freedom she was seeking? Or was it just escape? She had left everything behind, her life, her comfort, her marriage. The future she had imagined with Jackson was now just a shadow, fading as quickly as it had come. Isabella didn't know where to go. She had never truly planned for a life outside of Jackson's world. She had relied on him, on his promises, and now she was alone. Alone in a world that felt cold, unforgiving, and uncertain. Her phone buzzed, a message from her mother. "Are you okay, honey? You've been quiet." Isabella sighed, her fingers hovering over the screen. She couldn't explain to her mother, not yet. How could she? How could she explain the truth to the one person who had always supported her without making her feel like she had failed? She hit reply. "I'm fine, Mom. Just figuring things out." The message was a lie, but it was easier to say, easier than the truth. The truth that she had given everything to a man who never truly loved her, who had used her as a tool to save his fortune. The truth that she was now alone, trying to rebuild a life she never expected to have to build. When she arrived at a small, run-down apartment complex on the outskirts of town, the reality of her situation finally hit her. She was far from the life she had lived with Jackson. There was no grandeur, no luxury, no servants or sprawling gardens. But it was hers. For the first time in a long while, Isabella felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months: control. She wasn't sure what the future held. She didn't have a clear plan, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely lost. She had her own strength, her own will to fight. But Jackson's shadow still loomed over her. The betrayal, the lies, they were impossible to escape. He was everywhere, in the way she saw people look at her, in the whispers of the past, in the reminders of everything she had lost. That night, as she sat on the edge of the bed in her new apartment, the phone rang again. It was Jackson. She stared at the screen for a moment, her finger hovering over the answer button. Her heart raced, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. Every part of her wanted to hear him apologize, to hear him say that it had all been a mistake, that he still loved her. But deep down, she knew better. She knew there was nothing left to salvage, no more apologies to accept. Jackson had used her, manipulated her into believing that she was part of something meaningful, something real. But now that she was on her own, she realized the truth. He wasn't the man she thought he was, and she couldn't keep waiting for someone who would never change. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up. She stared at the screen for a moment longer before answering, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Jackson, I know you don't want to talk to me, Isabella," he said, his voice rough as if he hadn't slept. "But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She felt the sting of tears, but she forced them back. She wasn't going to let him see her broken. Not again. "I'm done, Jackson," she said, her voice steady, though every word felt like it was breaking her inside. "I can't keep doing this. You've hurt me too many times. I've given everything, and it's never enough." "I know," Jackson said quietly, a world of regret in his voice. "I've destroyed everything, but I need you to know I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." "You did, Jackson," Isabella replied softly, her heart heavy with the truth. "You did. And now I need to find my own way, without you." There was a long pause, and for a moment Isabella could hear the quiet sounds of his breathing on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a man who had lost everything, everything he had taken for granted. "I'm sorry, Isabella," he said again, and this time his voice cracked with emotion. "I'm so sorry." But she had nothing left to say to him. She hung up the phone, the weight of his words hanging in the silence of her apartment. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of her freedom, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. Days passed, and Isabella settled into her new life. The overwhelming weight of her decision to leave Jackson had finally begun to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of independence she hadn't known she'd been craving. The city had become her canvas, each street and alley a blank space where she could start anew. There was no more pretending, no more fighting to fit into a world that wasn't hers. She found herself working late at a small coffee shop, a place where she could hide from the world and, more importantly, from her past. She didn't mind the long hours. They gave her something to focus on, something tangible to hold on to while she rebuilt the pieces of her shattered life. There were no distractions here, no reminders of the man who had used her and abandoned her for the sake of his own survival. But as much as she had distanced herself, the memories of Jackson, of the love she had once believed they shared, still haunted her. His apology over the phone, the way he had broken down when she had told him she was done, lingered in her mind. Was he truly sorry, or was it just another part of his manipulation? One evening, as she wiped down the counter, the door opened. Isabella glanced up, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. There, standing in the doorway, was Jackson. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him in weeks, hadn't spoken to him since their final conversation. But here he was, standing in front of her like a man who had been stripped of everything, his eyes wide with desperation. "Isabella," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She froze, the motion of wiping the counter coming to an abrupt halt. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't prepared for him to show up. Not like this. Not after everything. Her eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of the man she had once loved. But what she saw instead was a broken man, someone who had lost everything, including his own identity. "What are you doing here, Jackson?" Isabella's voice was steady, but the emotion bubbling beneath the surface threatened to break through. She couldn't hide the ache in her chest. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was stronger than this, that she had moved on. But now, looking at him, the walls she had built began to crumble. I need to talk to you," Jackson said, his voice filled with the weight of everything unspoken between them. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it, but I need you to understand something." Isabella's eyes narrowed, her arms crossed over her chest as she studied him. "What could you possibly say that would make any difference, Jackson? You've lied to me. You used me as a pawn in your game, and you let everything fall apart. There's nothing left for you to explain." Jackson flinched at her words, but he didn't look away. "I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to fix what I'd broken, but I want to try. I want to make it right. I've done terrible things, and I know I can't undo them, but I can still change. I can still do something different." Isabella shook her head, feeling a rush of anger and disbelief flood through her. "You think it's that easy? You think you can just show up and suddenly everything will be fine? You think that after all you've done, you can just change?" Jackson stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "No, I don't expect you to forgive me, Isabella. I don't expect you to come back to me. But I need you to know that I've spent every day since you left trying to figure out what went wrong. I've been working, really working to fix the mess I created, not just for the business, but for myself." Isabella was silent for a moment, her mind swirling with the memories of everything she had been through. She had spent so much time thinking about him, wondering if there was anything left of the man she had once believed in. And here he was, standing in front of her, a man broken by his own mistakes. She had never wanted him to suffer. She had never wanted to leave him in this state. But the reality was, he had chosen this path. He had made his own decisions, and now he had to live with the consequences. "I can't help you, Jackson," she said softly, but with a firmness that she hadn't known she had. "You're the one who has to fix this, not me. And I can't keep sacrificing myself for someone who never truly saw me for who I was." Jackson's face fell, the pain in his eyes evident. He looked away as if unable to bear the weight of her words. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need you to understand. This isn't about the business anymore. It's about me. It's about who I've become, and I can't fix it unless I do it on my own. But I wanted you to know." He paused, and for a moment, Isabella saw a glimmer of the man she had once fallen in love with. There was no arrogance, no bravado, just vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Isabella, I'm so sorry." The words hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't just the apology. It was the acknowledgement. For the first time, Jackson had truly admitted that he had wronged her. And for the first time, she felt something stir inside her, something between sadness and relief. "I know you are," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it doesn't change what's happened. I have to move on, for both of us." Jackson nodded, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "I understand." As he turned and walked away, Isabella felt a weight lift from her chest. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't broken. She was finally free. Isabella stood on the edge of the small bridge overlooking the river, her mind a chaotic whirlwind. It had been weeks since her final conversation with Jackson. She had walked away, rebuilt her life in ways she hadn't imagined, and yet here she was, standing at the crossroads of a decision that felt heavier than anything she had ever faced. She had tried to ignore the lingering thoughts of him, the memories of their time together, the way he had apologized, the vulnerability he had shown when he finally admitted to his wrongs. She had been through so much, but somehow, his words still haunted her. She had tried to move on, telling herself that she was better off without him, that she was finally free. But was she? The sound of footsteps behind her broke the silence. Without turning, she knew who it was. his presence, the way he moved, even the silence between them. She could feel him like a shadow, even now. Jackson had found her. "You're hard to find, you know that?" His voice was familiar, almost comforting, but beneath it she heard the pain. His voice had softened, worn down by regret. Isabella didn't answer immediately. She felt the cold breeze tugging at her hair, her hands clutching the railing in front of her. She had told herself that she wasn't going to look back, that she had made her choice. But here he was, standing in front of her again, forcing her to face the part of her heart she had tried so hard to bury. "I'm not here to make excuses," Jackson continued, his voice rough. "I'm here because I need you to know that I've changed. I know I messed up. I've spent every day since you left trying to fix myself. I've realized something." Isabella finally turned to face him, the anger that had once burned inside her simmering into something calmer, more painful. She had been through so much in the last few weeks, and yet, standing in front of him, she still felt that pull, that ache in her chest. "You've realized what, Jackson?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "That I can't do this without you," he said, his gaze intense. "I can't pretend like nothing matters anymore. I've tried. But I'm not the same man I was before you left. I'm not the man I was when you first met me. I've learned the hard way what it means to truly love someone, and I want to prove that to you, if you'll give me the chance." Her heart pounded, and for a moment the world felt like it was spinning again. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to reach out, to let herself fall back into his arms. But she couldn't. Not anymore. She had spent too many years allowing his mistakes to define her, too many years wondering if she was good enough for someone who couldn't see her for who she truly was. "Jackson," Isabella said softly, her eyes welling up but her voice steady. "I can't just forget everything that's happened. You used me. You hurt me. And you kept lying to me over and over again." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hope. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't expect it. But I need you to understand that I've changed. The man I was, the one who made all those decisions, he's gone. I'm not him anymore. I'm trying to be better." Isabella shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "Trying isn't enough, Jackson. You've had your chances and you wasted them all. I gave you everything, and you still chose your lies over me." She paused, stepping back from him, her heart heavy with the weight of her own words. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep waiting for you to change, to finally be the man I need you to be. I have to let you go." Jackson looked crushed. He reached out, but she took another step back, shaking her head. His pain was palpable, but she had her own battles to fight now. She had given him everything she had, and it wasn't enough. She couldn't keep sacrificing her peace, her self-respect, for someone who might never understand what real love looked like. For the first time in their entire relationship, Isabella realized something crucial. She deserved better. She deserved a love that wasn't built on lies, a life that wasn't tethered to someone else's mistakes. She couldn't be the person who kept holding on, waiting for Jackson to be someone he couldn't be for her. "I'm sorry, Jackson," she whispered, her voice trembling with finality. "But this is where we say goodbye. You have to walk your own path now. I'm walking mine." There was a long silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jackson stood motionless, as though frozen in place, unable to process the finality in her voice. But then he nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his own failures. "I understand," he said softly. "I always understood, and I'm sorry." Isabella took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she turned away, not looking back. The path ahead of her wasn't clear, and she didn't have all the answers. But she knew one thing for sure. She had made the hardest decision of her life, and she was finally free. As she walked away from him, she felt the last remnants of her heartache begin to fall away, piece by piece. She was no longer tied to the past. She was ready to move forward, to build a life for herself, without the burden of Jackson's mistakes holding her down. She was finally free,